Scratch. Wampum. Dough. Money. That which separates the haves from the have-nots. Half of all American adults have more credit card debt than savings. 25% have no savings at all. And only 15% of the population is on track to fund what made us the greatest country on earth. Patience, frugality, sacrifice. When you boil it down, what do those three things have in common? Those are choices. Money is not peace of mind. Money is not happiness. Money is, at its essence, that measure of a man's choices.
You probably wouldn't hear these words coming out of the mouth of a politician here in the United States. This little diatribe is perhaps even too blunt to be delivered by a shrewd CEO when giving a pep talk to his staff. No, this speech was not delivered on the campaign trail, or in an address to the nation, or at some trade convention, or in a boardroom. It was actually a kind of sales pitch delivered by Marty Byrde to a couple of potential clients. Byrde is the protagonist of Ozark, a crime drama on Netflix. He's a financial planner who moves with his family to a summer resort community in, you guessed it, the Ozarks. Hello, and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Now, if you haven't watched the first season of Ozark, you might want to do so before watching the rest of this video. I'll be getting into spoiler territory from this point forward. If you've seen the first season, you'll recall that the protagonist's motives for moving to the Ozarks are not exactly benign. Essentially, he's been tasked with carrying out a massive money laundering operation by his employer, a Mexican drug lord by the name of Camino del Rio. I contend that Ozark is not your run-of-the-mill crime drama. Beneath the surface of this series lies a peculiar sort of ideological tension at play. I'd like to make the case that Ozark is a case study about the contradictions that are intrinsic to the American work ethic. As evidenced by Marty's little spiel at the beginning of the first episode, the manner in which work is valued is distinctly puritanical. It's not valued as a means to some end, but rather for its own sake. Work is a first-order principle, something that good, responsible people just do. Money is just a measuring unit for one's choices. It's a matter of personal responsibility. It's all about how hard you work, right? It is something of a sick irony that by the end of the very first episode, Marty finds himself in a situation where he is essentially forced to work tirelessly or be killed. Marty Byrde is a hard worker. That much is true, but he's not quite the upstanding citizen he presents himself as. I would go so far as to say that he's not a good person, and what he's working towards throughout the first season is quite simply the gradual destruction of his family and the further economic degradation of a beautiful region in Missouri. This doesn't seem to be his intention, but it is what his actions are leading to. But more than that, Ozark is about the dominance of appearances, representations, and symbols in American culture, and how the prizing of such abstractions over the reality of the material world will inevitably lead to negative consequences. This plays out in literal terms right before our very eyes. For instance, Russ Langmore and his brother end up getting electrocuted because they believe that this here boat is their path to fortune. At this point, they plan on murdering Marty and taking his money. They had a false assumption about the nature of the world around them. Namely, Russ didn't anticipate the lengths his niece would go to in order to preserve her, let's just say, employment status. The dubious nature of representations is a recurring theme throughout the first season. Throughout the course of these 10 episodes, Marty continually misrepresents the nature of his character. And not so coincidentally, this is precisely what Marty does with the money he launders. He obscures the source of the money. He makes the money appear as though it was attained through legal means. He changes its character, or at least the appearance of its character. Marty is what the kids might call performatively woke. He pays lip service to being a good person, a progressive even in certain ways. And you know, he might actually believe he is essentially a good person in this way. But in reality, we the viewers see that by the end of the first season, Marty has really caused a lot of pain and suffering through his actions. Let's take, for instance, this scene where Marty defends a kid with Down syndrome and ends up getting socked in the face for this seemingly heroic act. This is actually a concerted effort on Marty's behalf to demonstrate that he's a stand-up guy. He does this in order to convince a business owner, Rachel Garrison, to accept his proposal as a would-be angel investor, which we the viewers know is actually an elaborate ruse. Marty's using this business owner to launder money. He gets her wrapped up in a dangerous and illegal activity, and he puts her business in jeopardy in the process. Ozark has a reoccurring intro sequence in which various symbols are depicted. These symbols prefigure certain elements in the story that take place in the episode. We might well think of the O in this sequence as the episode's narrative arc. I would further speculate that the correlation between symbols and events in the plot is the show's attempt to get the viewer to think in metaphorical terms. Over the course of the first season, I often found myself asking what certain characters or events were meant to represent, and I noticed a bit of a reoccurring motif, if you will. A lot of the rhetoric Marty employs in the course of justifying his actions reminded me in various ways of the sorts of things politicians say in the course of justifying neoliberal policies.
A year ago, Americans' faith in their governmental process was steadily declining. 6 out of 10 Americans were saying they were pessimistic about their future. A new kind of defeatism was heard. Some said our domestic problems were uncontrollable, that we had to learn to live with this seemingly endless cycle of high inflation and high unemployment. Together, we not only cut the increase in government spending nearly in half, we brought about the largest tax reductions and the most sweeping changes in our tax structure since the beginning of this century.
But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is a liberal policy.
In short, I've come to believe that Ozark is an allegorical account of neoliberalization as it is playing out in history. Essentially, I think it's a parable about the folly of this particular form of politics and management of the global economy. In order to demonstrate this, I need to do an overview of neoliberalism and the history of its application. And since I'm working within the bounds of a short video, the best I can really do is a cursory overview of the topic. But if you'd like to know more, I'll have additional sources in the video description. And if you disagree or think I'm wildly off base with my analysis, feel free to sound off in the comments, although I reserve the right to delete anything hateful or not constructive. Now, I should take a second to note that the way we use the term liberal here in the US is a bit idiosyncratic. Basically, it's used to refer to anyone in the Democratic Party, or even worked on Obama's state Senate campaign. But I digress. The point here, connotations that might be unfamiliar to the average American. And when you hear the word neoliberalism, the thing you really ought to understand is that it's not exactly a reference to the typical dichotomy of liberals and conservatives that is usually called to mind here in the US. Neoliberalism is a modern iteration of an ideology called classical liberalism, at least insofar as it is adherent to capitalism as the prevailing mode of production. Both Democrats and Republicans here in the US are fundamentally liberal using this broader definition, at least in the sense that they have a general belief in capitalism and so-called free markets. Now, liberalism has a rich and complex philosophical tradition, and it's brought us values such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the separation of church and state. All good things in my book. The thing we're going to focus on in this video is economic liberalization, because this is the context in which neoliberalism is best understood. You might think of neoliberalism as an outgrowth of liberal ideology, though perhaps not the best or most rash terms of market forces. We can even observe this in the modern-day political discourse. In fact, it's on display in near pathological terms in certain dusty corners of the internet. For instance, the entire notion of the marketplace of ideas is quintessentially a neoliberal thing to espouse. Neoliberalism has a few essential characteristics. Deregulation. Essentially, this is when the government cuts regulations, making it easier for corporations to fuck over people and ruin the environment. Austerity. This is the process of cutting government spending to balance the budget. However, this often entails cutting programs that provide relief to those in dire financial situations. And when the working class is more focused on survival than political or economic issues, it's a major advantage for wealthy elites. Privatization. This is when the government enables private companies to get their hands on entire sectors of the economy that were previously considered public for the purpose of further enriching the ruling class. Free trade. Free trade is the unrestricted exchange of imports and exports between countries. For those competing for jobs on the global stage, this can mean dislocation and economic turmoil. These policies are being enacted in service of private entities, namely corporate interests, the likes of which are totally unaccountable to the public. And as neoliberal policies have gone into effect, the institutions which have previously allowed for the possibility of public participation have been gradually weakened over time. In effect, this has widened the gap between the rich and the poor, and it's meant less economic stability for the vast majority of people. Since the 1970s, economists have observed that wages have not kept up with productivity gains. In fact, the three wealthiest people in the United States, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, have more wealth than the entire bottom half of the population, 160 million people. This kind of wealth inequality is not a characteristic of a stable system. It's a symptom of a problem that's systemic in nature, i.e., the dominance of neoliberalization, the mechanism by which wealthy people are able to influence the state in order to advance their class. Ask yourself this question: what will happen if you quit your job? If the answer is that you will eventually be homeless and without the amenities needed to live, congratulations, you are a working class person. If you need to work in order to live, you're working class. It's right there in the name. As you might expect, the vast majority of people in this country and indeed the world are working class. And since this is the case, one would be justified in believing that our economy should be centered around making the lives of working class people as good as they can possibly be. One would think the primary goal of such an economy would be to ensure that working class people have all their basic needs met. This is evidently not the case, but perhaps more to the point, if one is virtually forced to work for a private company or a corporation whose express purpose, mind you, is not to advance the common good, but rather to enrich its shareholders, if one is compelled to work for such an entity in order to live, in order to not be homeless, in what sense is that person really free? In what sense is this sort of arrangement the most fulfilling environment for the individual? We in the US are experiencing a peculiar phenomenon as of late. Our economy appears to be doing well. We have historically low unemployment, the lowest it's been since before the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s. But despite the tightening of the labor market, economists have observed that we are not seeing a commensurate rise in wages. This is something that should theoretically come along with a low rate of unemployment. The less workers there are competing for jobs, the more companies have to pay in order to attract people to vacant positions. The economy has added something like 150 to 200,000 jobs a month for the past few years. And yet, workers are not seeing the full benefits of what, by most other indications, would appear to be a period of healthy economic growth. Meanwhile, both healthcare and education costs are skyrocketing, so workers are taking more and more of a hit in that regard as well. There are some plausible ideas as to why this is happening, but there's no obvious mechanism to account for the phenomenon in a classical economic framework. So, what can account for it? Well, one possibility is that the baseline for what economists consider full employment is not entirely accurate, and that's a plausible explanation, but there is one other explanation that makes sense to me as well. This wage stagnation is the result of decades of neoliberal policies at play. The financialization of our economy has created a dynamic by which wealth is so increasingly concentrated that certain large corporations hold a disproportionate share of market influence, and therefore set the industry standards by which workers are compensated. These companies hold so much leverage over workers that they're essentially in a position to engage in collusion. In practical terms, they have what economists refer to as a monopsony on the labor market. It is only through manipulation and the aid of the state that such corporations are able to maintain such a presence in the market. It is my contention that the process of laundering money, as seen in Ozark, serves quite aptly as a metaphor. It represents the sort of manipulation and financial shenanigans carried out when state power and corporate interests align. And it is absolutely perfect that the protagonist of this series, the human representation of neoliberalism in practice, is a privileged yuppie from Naperville, Illinois. But even the relative wealth Marty already possesses isn't enough for him. And so, he makes a deal with the devil. Not only is Marty doing business with a murderous regime, he is also gambling with the lives of his children. And the result of these machinations is quite simply that the most vulnerable people in the series are continually made to suffer. This is, I think, the perfect exemplification of neoliberalism in 2018. The state, as represented by FBI agent Roy Petty, serves as an unwitting accomplice in a number of ways throughout the series. The foremost instance of this is Petty's treatment of Russ Langmore. Agent Petty sells Langmore a rather serious lie, namely the American dream. He leads Langmore to believe not only that their romantic relationship is genuine and sustainable, but also that he can make a new life for himself. At this point in the series, Langmore has gotten to a point where he is beginning to accept his sexual orientation, but we get the sense that he's been in a state of constant inner turmoil for quite some time due to rampant homophobia in the region. Petty exploits this dynamic in order to put Russ in a corner. He coerces Langmore into becoming an informant. It is perhaps the most ruthless act in the series thus far, and as we know, it leads to the demise of both Langmore and his brother. Neoliberalism has been exported to other parts of the world as well. For instance, the International Monetary Fund, funded by wealthy countries, gives loans to developing countries. But those countries must comply with the demands of the IMF. Namely, they are compelled to adopt neoliberal policies. Oftentimes, they have to privatize state services and enact low tax rates on corporations. The rationale is that such policies will improve living conditions in these developing countries. But this is not exactly a good faith exchange. I'd say it's better understood as a form of coercion, since the alternative to adopting the IMF's conditions is diplomatic isolation and possibly even hostile relations with Western countries. In South America, for instance, those countries that refused to comply with the neoliberal agenda were subject to various efforts to undermine their regimes, often in the form of covert CIA operations. The beneficiaries of these neoliberal policies are, in large part, transnational corporations. in a certain buying Marty's act and taking his investment, and subsequently, she becomes entangled in a series of relationships that entail murder and other horrendous activities. Of course, we find ourselves at a certain end of such activities in the course of our everyday lives. It's just a bit more convoluted than operating as a money laundering pawn for the cartel. Or maybe it's not. Here, let me give this a shot. Our tax money is funding ICE, which is carried out by what most definitions would be considered an atrocity, i.e., the forced separation of children from their families, as well as the involuntary detention of people for no reason other than they happen to be born in another, more turbulent part of the world, and they rationally decided to come here for the possibility of a better life. This, in my view, is when neoliberal policies allow for the rise of fascism. The tendency for businesses to exploit uneven economic development across the globe tends to create a dynamic by which employers from different countries are pitted against one another in competition for jobs. This makes it easier for the far right to scapegoat foreigners for economic problems that are actually a product of the system. Of course, racism plays an essential role as well. With this in mind, let's recall the scenario in which the Snells, a local crime family in the Ozarks, employ the use of a religious sermon held on the river as the place to conduct their business, i.e., selling drugs. It kind of takes Marx's whole religion is the opiate of the masses thing to a whole new level, doesn't it? But I don't think this is a tongue-in-cheek reference to Marx, or at least it's not just that. It is no small coincidence that the Snell family has cemented their position in the community in part with the aid of religious institutions in said community. The role myth plays in their ideology is paramount. The Snell family seems to be the embodiment of white supremacy and, to a broader extent, fascism. I say this not merely because the Snells are overtly racist, but that's definitely part of it. The Snells have an elaborate and romanticized narrative pertaining to their family history. This is a hallmark feature of fascism. Umberto Eco referred to this as the cult of tradition. The Snells operate in large part on the basis of a myth that they have cultivated about their family. It is one in which the Snells have been oppressed by outside forces. On this basis, the Snells justify ruthlessness and violence. This is precisely how fascism works. Of course, this myth doesn't quite hold up to any sort of scrutiny. Their land was originally that of the Native Americans, and it is a historical fact that American settlers committed genocide against the indigenous people of this region. So when you really think about it, the Snells' whole myth is a sort of disingenuous manipulation of historical fact. It's an inversion of the truth. Not that the Snells particularly care about the facts of the situation. On top of all that, the Snells have been exploiting people in this area for years. It is certainly not a coincidence that Marty finds himself stuck between the cartel and the Snell family. Neoliberal politics is contingent upon the illusion of a reasonable center position. It is the case that in U.S. politics, at least, the liberal position is one that prizes this notion of bipartisanship. It is sadly the case that Democrats often end up selling out their own constituents prior to the debate having even started. Neoliberalism is an ideology with a cunning tendency. It tries to evade the very idea of ideology itself. It frames itself as above politics. Moreover, it's quite often a manner of framing one's own position as that of the center, the reasonable person in the room, looking for common ground between two fixed positions. This is, of course, a lie, but it's an alluring one. The most effective ideologies in present day are the ones that present themselves not as ideologies per se, but rather just the normative perspective, the normal way of looking at things. Marty, the head of his household, that the political spectrum is itself a construct. It's a human conception, and this is fair enough. It's just a way to conceptualize political ideologies. But the notion of framing one's own political position to be that of the center, This is an ideological position in and of itself. It's self-justifying. Where you position the center on this continuum is itself a choice. It's an ideological choice. By positioning oneself as the reasonable center, one promotes the idea of a politics guided by civility and reason. At face value, this is commendable. When individuals are all acting in good faith with the same access to resources and information, civility is a great norm to have. But that's not the world we live in. In practice, this idea that civility is the guiding principle for political discourse betrays a view of politics that maps far more credibly onto the real world, i.e., the idea that politics is at its core a conflict over power and resources. It's a fight over how power is allocated in society. And it should be no surprise that after Del Rio is murdered by the Snells, Marty immediately starts working for them. The neoliberal agent operates in service of capital, regardless of who is in possession of said capital. Ultimately, Marty doesn't value civility. He values power. That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. In the next video, I will be discussing the subliminal messages that reoccur throughout the movie Boss Baby, namely the continual imperative to, quote, seize the means of production. If you enjoy my videos and can spare a few bucks, please consider supporting me on Ko-fi.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Please know that any amount, large or small, is highly appreciated. Thank you for watching, and good night.